Hello everyone. This is probably going to be a shorter video than the last ones have been. That is in part because the script is a bit shorter because I've been very busy this week. I will be defending my thesis in the next few days, so that's very exciting, but obviously priorities have needed to shift. Nevertheless, I feel very strongly about this project that I want to keep my schedule consistent, and so I'm willing to make a shorter video if that is what I have prepared. So, and it works out nicely because the video script that I have is just another segment of commentary on just the very beginning still of the first section of the prologue, but it's thematically coherent. And after this video next week, I'll be getting into the actual speech itself. So, and then I think I'll actually be able to cover at least a good chunk of the speech all in the same video. So there you go. That's enough introduction. Let's get into it. When Zarathustra was 30 years old, he left his home and the lake of his home and went into the mountains. Here he savored his spirit and his solitude and would for 10 years not weary of them. But at last his heart transformed, and one morning he stood up with the dawn, stepped before the sun, and spake unto her thus. The pronoun which I translated as her is er, I-H-R. It's a German pronoun. I assume this will raise eyebrows for anyone who actually reads or speaks German. The word to which er is attached to in this context is Sonne, or sun, which is in the German language of feminine gender. Now, while er can function as feminine singular, as a feminine singular pronoun, it depends upon the context. And since Zarathustra is addressing an inanimate object, the sun, er is, as I understand it, properly translated as it. Nevertheless, I think this passage is an exception to that rule, because I believe that Nietzsche, possibly just unconsciously, but nevertheless, regarded the sun to be a feminine entity. My slight, but I think striking evidence for this is something which Nietzsche wrote down while interred at an asylum in 1890 or so. Quote, "Solitude is not painful, it ripens, but you must have the sun as a girlfriend," unquote. I got this quote, by the way, from Leonard Sachs's article on Nietzsche's mysterious illness. Granted, it's something that he wrote down during his breakdown, but I find it interesting because of how well it fits what's happening in this opening scene of Zarathustra. Zarathustra has enjoyed his solitude for 10 years, but at last the time has come for a change. His solitude, as it were, has ripened. It wasn't painful for him. He enjoyed it. He's said to have savored his spirit and his solitude, but now it has ripened, which is to say, it is ready to be harvested. That is to say, destroyed, in order to access the riches that it has stored up and, as it were, fermented within itself. As he says in the last speech of Book 1 on the gifting virtue, quote, "This is your thirst, to become sacrifices and gifts yourselves, and therefore you thirst to amass all riches in your soul," unquote. Thus, one may become a rich harvest for one's friends. The full meaning of this will be discussed more at the end of this present section of the prologue. The interim during which Zarathustra ripened was made bearable by the sun. His solitude was made bearable by the sun. For, as Zarathustra himself will soon tell us, one of his principal companions during his 10 years in the mountains was the sun, who arose for him each morn without fail. Thus, he endured his solitude because he had the sun as a girlfriend. We might even venture that the sun is the agent of Zarathustra's ripening during his solitude. Indeed, he will soon describe himself as taking from the sun her overflow, not unlike a plant drinking in the sunshine. In any case, sun imagery recurs throughout Zarathustra. At the end of Book 1, for instance, he declares, quote, "Gold shine maketh peace between moon and sun," unquote. We have here alchemical imagery, as far as I'm concerned, of the coincidence of opposites, or of the holy marriage between the god and the goddess, the masculine and feminine, but in inverted roles, right? Normally the moon is associated with the woman, the mother, and the sun is associated with the father, the masculine. But here it's inverted. Here we have implied a moon father and a sun mother. This is fascinating to me personally because I remember as a child being confused when I learned that traditionally the sun is considered to be the father. For I had always thought of the sun as a feminine figure throughout much of my childhood, a kind of laughing, joyful woman. The moon, which is mysterious and dark, seemed to me more appropriate for the masculine, and I identified more with the moon than with the sun, personally. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get back to it. Zarathustra has been in the mountains for 10 years, but at last his heart transformed. What does he do when his heart transforms? He stands up with the dawn. That is to say, he mimics the course of the sun, rising as the sun rises. And, as we shall see, he also intends to set just as the sun sets, to be, in fact, harvested for his wisdom. Zarathustra does not settle down. He moves in cycles, like the sun. This seems to be a part of the wisdom which he gained while in the mountains, that he should be like the sun. The sun does not move in a line, but in a circle around the earth. Obviously from a geocentric point of view, but we're speaking mythologically here, of course. The point is, thus, the sun never settles down in one spot, but eternally roves its self-same circuit through the heavens. It spends an hour in each house of the heavens before moving on. But do not weep for this, for the sun shall eventually return again to that very same house. If you will indulge a quotation from the Revelations of Joseph Smith, quote, "Behold, I will liken these kingdoms unto a man having a field, and he sent forth his servants into the field to dig in the field. And he said unto the first, Go ye and labor in the field, and in the first hour I will come unto you, and ye shall behold the joy of my countenance. And he said unto the second, Go ye also into the field, and in the second hour I will visit you with the joy of my countenance. And also unto the third, saying, I will visit you, and unto the fourth, and so on unto the 12th. And the Lord of the field went unto the first in the first hour, and tarried with him all that hour. And he was made glad with the light of the countenance of his Lord. And then he withdrew from the first, that he might visit the second also, and the third, and the fourth, and so on unto the 12th. And thus they all received the light of the countenance of their Lord, every man in his hour, and in his time, and in his season, beginning at the first, and so on unto the last, and from the last unto the first, and from the first unto the last, every man in his own order, until his hour was finished, even according as his Lord had commanded him, that his Lord might be glorified in him, and he in his Lord, that they might all be glorified. Therefore, Unto this parable I will liken all these kingdoms, and the inhabitants thereof, every kingdom in its hour, and in its time, and in its season, even according to the decree which God hath made." Unquote. That's from Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, verses 51 through 61. The wisdom of the eternal recurrence could be expressed thus, that becoming, rightly understood, is true being. This is Nietzsche's critique of Plato, and, in Nietzsche's view, by extension, all religious traditions that have hitherto existed, especially Christianity. They unconsciously identify being with death and immobility, rather than with life and mobility. If something is continually becoming, then it has no fixed being. We cannot say of it, once and for all, it is this or that. We cannot say of the acorn, for instance, that it is an acorn, without specifying it is an acorn right now, for eventually it will change and transform into an oak tree. Eventually that oak tree will die and become earth. So which of these three things was it? Acorn, oak tree, or dirt? It depends upon the time. To combat this problem, Plato posited the theory of forms, which states that the natural world, which is constantly changing, is not fully real, since it does not have a fixed being. It's continually changing. Rather, the natural world is like a series of shadows cast upon a wall by flickering firelight. The shadows morph and change and are altogether ephemeral and illusory. Reality is something beyond these shadows, something that has a fixed, eternal character and thus attains actual being. These, for Plato, are the forms. The forms are unchanging, and by virtue of being unchanging, they are immobile, eternal. They actually exist in the proper sense of the word. They have being, like an ancient mosquito preserved perfectly in a shard of amber. In Book 2, Zarathustra has a nightmare where, quote, "I had renounced all life. Thus I dreamed. I had become a night watchman and guardian of graves, there on the lonely mountain fortress of death. Up there I guarded his coffins. The musty vaults stood full of such symbols of conquest. From glass coffins, conquered life looked out at me." Unquote. The imagery, then, is not unlike that of a mosquito preserved in amber or a skeleton preserved in ice. Its preservation, its eternal life, quotation marks, in this sense, is actually no more than an eternal death. The nightmare ends when a black coffin appears and opens, releasing a bizarre panoply of images like Pandora's box opening. This, I believe, in the nightmare, symbolizes the eternal recurrence, coming back, a resurrection of the whole universe, everything starting over again and being rejuvenated. But, I mean, we'll get there when we eventually get there. So, in any case, Nietzsche argues that the Platonic forms and all things like them are a fiction. There is no eternally unchanging world behind the world we experience. If there is a world behind our world, then it is a world best characterized by the phrase will to power. And will to power is always in a state of transformation and self-overcoming. But we're going to get into that much later. We're not getting into that right now. Because there are no forms for Nietzsche, there are no fixed beings or identities. All identities are put up by the perceiver for practical purposes. They have no deeper justification than the arbitration of the perceiver. Everything is becoming. Everything is in motion, changing from one thing to another, moment to moment. Does this not lead to nihilism? If everything is changing, if everything is passing away, including you and me, never to be retrieved again, then is not everything vain? Are we not specks of dust soon to disappear? What does anything matter if it is all to be swallowed up in an infinity of nothingness on either side of the finite timeline? I think that Nietzsche answers, yeah, it would lead to nihilism. But the cure is the doctrine of eternal recurrence. How so? Because eternal recurrence says that although everything is always becoming and never stays the same forever, nevertheless becoming goes in a circle. There are a finite number of states which the universe can actualize over an infinite length of time. Consequently, Nietzsche argues, the sequence must eventually repeat itself. Thus, there is being, but only as a function of the cyclical becoming of the entire universe. Thus, every entity in the universe has an eternal being by virtue of the cycle of becoming in which they participate. The unconscious goal of Plato and of similar systems of thought is to seek the ending of the cycle. That is, to seek a state of eternal rest and get done with the exhausting business of living. Life is thus, as a kind of mercy and relief, pictured to be a finite line. One is born at one end, and one dies at the other end. The atheist rejoices that they don't have to go on with living and they will simply cease existing. That's their mercy. Meanwhile, the theist rejoices that they will not have to go on living and will get to laze about in heaven or something like this. But Nietzsche thirsts for eternal life, even at the cost of having to live his life over and over again. So well disposed is he to existence in general. To quote Joseph Smith again, is it logic to say that a spirit is immortal and yet has a beginning? Because if a spirit has a beginning, it will have an end. That is good logic. I take my ring from my finger and liken it unto the mind of man, the immortal spirit, because it has no beginning. Suppose I cut it in two. As the Lord lives, because it has a beginning, it would have an end. All the fools and learned and wise men from the beginning of creation who say that man had a beginning prove that he must have an end. If that were so, the doctrine of annihilation would be true." Unquote. That's from the King Follett Discourse. In another discourse, Joseph Smith declared, quote, "Every principle proceeding from God is eternal, and any principle which is not eternal is of the devil." Unquote. Also that, quote, "The first step in the salvation of men is the laws of eternal and self-existent principles." Unquote. In any case, Zarathustra is not seeking a position of eternal rest. Rather, he has found a circle of life rhythm that brings him the greatest happiness. He rests in the mountains until finally he reaches a breaking point and returns back to humanity, until he wearies of that and returns to solitude. It is notable that this sort of cycle was explicitly denounced by Schopenhauer, sort of his mentor from beyond the grave, as a fault of existence, that we are driven by desires which, as soon as they are satisfied, immediately become new desires. Thus we are led endlessly on from vain pleasure to vain pleasure. But Nietzsche rejects Schopenhauer's value judgment and instead celebrates this eternal nature of desire. He does not want the game to ever end, and is willing to invent a means of resurrection, the eternal recurrence, in order to play the game eternally. So that's all I've got. Like I said, this is the shortest video I've done in this series. Next week will likely be much longer, as I really dig into what Zarathustra actually proceeds to say to the sun. But yeah, we'll get to that when we get to that. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.